benvenuti. This is a video about conjugation of Italian verbs in the present tense. So if you're studying Italian or want to practice conjugation in the present tense, I hope you find this video helpful. So with that in mind, just to kind of go over what a conjugation is for people who might not have studied a language in the past, or a Latin language or Italian or French, etc. A conjugation is essentially what it is it's a link between a subject and a verb in a sentence. So, for example, if you want to say he runs in English, he is your subject, runs is your verb. Well, in Italian, the way you would get an output like this with a subject and a verb is you would start with the verb, correre means to run, and you would conjugate it. And you would conjugate it into the third person singular format or conjugation of this verb, which is corre. Corre means he runs, or she runs, or it runs. Any type of third person singular actor or subject. And based off of the context of this conjugation, you'll know that it's he runs, because there will be a sentence there that'll give you that information. With that in mind, there are three basic steps you'll always have to do in order to conjugate a verb, no matter what tense you're working in, anything. The first thing you'll always have to do, you'll have to identify what subject is performing the verb. So, is it third person singular? Is it he? Is it I? First person singular? Is it you all? Second person plural? Etc. What subject are you working with? Second, you'll have to identify what verb is being performed, running, correre. And in Italian, there are three main types of verbs you'll come across. There are ere verbs, correre is one example. There are are verbs, verbs that end in are, and ire verbs, verbs that end in ire. I'm going to go over that a little bit later, but just keep that in mind. So there are a couple different types of verbs you'll be working with, but obviously identifying which specific verb you're going to be conjugating is the next logical step. Or I guess you could say, well, I guess you could flip these two, but lastly, you'll have to identify what tense of the verb you're going to conjugate in. Obviously, for this video, we're just working in the present tense. As you become more sophisticated with the language, obviously that will change. You'll have, past tense and remote past and future and all sorts of great tenses to conjugate into. But for now, we can kind of ignore this third step. We're always going to be working in the present tense for this video. So, moving forward into a subject pronoun review, like I said, identifying your subject pronoun is really your first step, the first step you'll want to take to conjugate a verb. So you'll need to know whether you're working in the first person singular, second person singular, or third person singular, or the respective plural versions of the subject pronoun. So to sort of translate these into Italian, I'm giving you the subject pronouns themselves in Italian. So first person singular pronoun in Italian, io. It's the same as I. You, second person singular, is a little bit funky in Italian. It depends on whether you're familiar with the person, like they're a family member or a friend, or if there's someone who you really don't know or you're in a formal setting. If it's somebody who you are familiar with, like family, you'll use the tu form, which is informal, and it has its own conjugation. If it's a formal setting, you'll use the lei form, and that's actually the same form as a third person singular. I'll point this out when we get to the actual conjugations to sort of show you the difference, but just know that when you're dealing with somebody in a formal setting, somebody who you don't know or somebody who you're meeting for the first time, the proper way to conjugate that verb is to use the third person singular, not the second person singular. Now, having said that, if you're a new speaker and you do that, I would not take offense if somebody did that to me. Obviously, I don't live in Italy, but nobody in my family has ever done that to anybody who's talked to them in Italian, and there have been people who they don't really know who have talked to them in that way, and they don't get like offended by it. So, but properly, that's the way it's supposed to work. Moving forward, lui means he, lei means she or you in a formal sense. Noi means we. Voi means you all, so that's the second person plural. And loro means they, the third person plural. So knowing these subject pronouns, you're going to have one conjugation per subject pronoun. So one for the first person singular, one for the second person singular, one for the third person singular, both he and she, both genders. One for we, one for you all, and one for they. So let's talk about present tense conjugation. For the present tense, you can divide up verbs into the three types we talked about earlier, are, ere, and ire verbs. And you can also think of irregular verbs as sort of being their own category. And here's what I mean by that. These verbs here that end in the are, ere, and ire styles that are regular, they're all going to follow the same basic format. You can almost think of these ones as like a machine or something. You're going to have a verb that's like the input, and when you put in that input, you'll be able to spit out conjugations, just, you know, mechanically. You'll just be able, it's like a formula. Irregular verbs, on the other hand, you're going to have to just memorize. It sucks. Everybody has to memorize them. Once you get the hang of them, though, they're just as easy as all of these, really. And these are some of the more common words, like more important words that you're going to be using a lot. So knowing the irregular verbs is important, but that's just going to come with time. So don't feel too bad if these take a little bit of time. But these ones here, what's nice is once you know how to do one of them, you can just look at a verb that ends in are, and you can conjugate it like all the other ones that end in are, except the irregulars. Same with these two. So the way you want to go about conjugating is you'll want to identify the stem of each verb. For these verbs here, are verbs, everything prior to are, are, is the stem. And I'm going to show you an example of that in the next slide. But and the same thing is true with ere verbs. Everything before ere is a stem. Everything before ire is a stem for ire verbs. So that stem is going to be common between all 6 of your conjugations. And you'll change the ending, this part here, based off of the subject pronoun you're working with. So let's kind of illustrate that. We're working with are verbs, are verbs. A couple examples of them. Parlare means to talk. Restare means to stay or remain, but think of it as to stay. So let's conjugate parlare. In the first person singular, we're going to add an O to the end of the stem. Second person singular, we'll add an I. Third person singular, we'll add an A. First person plural, we'll add an iamo, I-A-M-O. Second person plural, we'll add a ate, A-T-E. And third person plural, we'll add an ano, A-N-O. Now, I went through that all very quickly. I'm going to explain a little bit more here. So you'll notice, this is that stem I was talking about. Everything before the ARE. Everything before the ARE. Doesn't matter what verb you're working with, as long as it's not irregular, you'll always be able to chop off a stem like that for present tense conjugation. And these endings are going to be common between all of these are verbs. So, to go through these in a little bit more detail now. When you're saying, I do something, I talk, you'll say, parlo. You don't need to say, io parlo. You can just say, parlo. Why? Because, well, as we talked about, this conjugation is taking the verb parlare and it's combining it with this subject pronoun, io. By saying parlo, you're basically saying io parlare. Like, that's not literally what you're saying, but in a sense, what you're signifying is I am the one who's doing this verb, talking. And then the same thing is true with restare. You could say resto. That would be the equivalent of saying I stay. And the same is true for all of these other subject pronouns. So if you're using an are verb and you're talking about a second person singular person in the informal, this is where that informal part comes into play. If you're talking to your brother, okay, and you're saying you talk, you say parli, parli, with an I at the end of it. If you're saying you stay in the informal, resti, resti. You add an I to the end of this restare stem. Now, this is where we get into that formal second person singular. If you're talking to a stranger who you've not met before, and you're saying he talks or she talks if it's a lady, you add an A to the end of that stem. Parla. Or if you're saying what's a talking animal? What's a Garfield, the talking cat? It talks, right? Parla. Add an A to the end of the stem. For if you're saying we talk, add your yamo, or you can do the same thing to this stem here. Restiamo for restare. Voi, if you're saying you all or y'all are talking, you could say parlate. Or if you're saying you all stay, restate. This ate is going to be common for all regular are verbs. All of these endings are common for are verbs. If you're talking about them or they, you'd say parlano, parlano, or restano, restano. Again, once you get the hang of the conjugations, they're very, very easy. But the key is you just have to know that, again, when you're working with are verbs, these are the endings you'll use for all regular are verbs. And we're going to do plenty of practice problems, so don't worry. And I'm going to give a couple more examples. But let's move on to, well, actually, I do have examples right after. Okay. So let's conjugate abbandonare, which means to abandon in the present tense. Right? So, we're saying I abandon, abbandono. Here's that, where that stem ends. Abbandono, well, actually, the stem is abandon, and then o. That's where that addition gets added in to conjugate it into the first person singular tense. Abbandoni, abbandona, abbandoniamo, abbandonate, abbandonano. Abbandonano. I put an extra N there in Italian. That's a no-no. So, yeah, this is, again, you can see every regular ARE verb conjugated exactly like this. Some helpful tips here. Are verbs, and the same is going to be true for the other ones. For the third person singular, it will always end in an A. This O is going to be true for all regular verbs. Actually, it's going to be true for all present tense verbs. They all, if you're talking about yourself, do I speak, I talk, I read, all of them, the first person singular will always end in an O. And actually, the second person informal will always end in an I. What you'll see later on is that the only ones that change are the third person singular, the second person plural, and the third person plural. These three, io, tu, and noi, these endings off the stem are going to be the same for all of our types of verbs, with the exception of the irregulars, because there the stem will change, and you know that's a little bit different. But these are your are verbs. Moving on to some practice for that. So I'm going to give you a minute, and you can conjugate these verbs and see how well you do. So I've labeled your subjects in yellow. Don't worry too much about, obviously I'm assuming if you're learning Italian you might not know how to say Easter, it's Pasqua, but the main thing you want to do is you want to conjugate the verb. And I've given you the verb in the parentheses. So see if you can conjugate these three. I'm going to just skip ahead. You can pause this video. This is your warning, pause, and if you want to practice, go ahead. And here are your answers. So if you want to say he cooks for Easter, cucina per la Pasqua. If you want to say they sing every day, cantano ogni giorno. And if you want to say I always dance, ballo sempre. Italian, you can also kind of change the ordering around. Sempre ballo, always I dance. Like, you know, people will understand what you're saying. It's not quite as rigid as in English, because if you say like always I dance, you'll talk like Yoda, and people will probably think you're like a loser or something. But in Italian, that's totally acceptable, by the way, to reverse those. But this is your are verbs. And now we're going to go through the same basic exercises with the other types of verbs. So now we're on ere verbs, ere verbs. Some examples. Prendere means to take. Leggere means to read. So let's conjugate prendere. Prendo, prendi, prende, prendiamo, prendete, prendono. So once again, you'll see that the io, tu, and noi endings are the same as with the are verbs. The only ones you're changing are the third person singular, second person plural, and third person plural. So in English, what are we saying? We're saying I take, you take, he or she takes, we take, you all take, or they take. And let's run through them again. Prendo, prendi, prende, prendiamo, prendete, prendono. And we can do the same thing for leggere if you want. Of course, if you haven't, I'm assuming if you're watching this, you know how to pronounce the verbs. But maybe I should. I'm not gonna. You know what? I'm not gonna do that. That's gonna be confusing, maybe. All right. So let's conjugate another verb. Decidere means to decide. Let's conjugate it in the present tense. If you want, you can pause this video and try it out. But obviously this isn't the practice part, so let's conjugate it. Decido, decidi, decide, decidiamo, decidete, decidetono. Decido, decidi, decide, decidiamo, decidete, decidetono. So once again, you'll see these conjugation endings are going to be true for every single ere verb that's normal, I should say. That's a regular ere verb. So let's do the same thing we did last time, and I'll give you a few minutes. Well, you can pause this if you want. Try to conjugate the verbs, the stuff in yellow. I've given you the verbs next to them. So see what you can do. So if you want to say she laughs with her, ride con lei. You want to say you all break the car when you all drive it, rompete la macchina quando la guidate. And actually I included two of them in there. Guidare is the verb to drive, but it's not an ere verb, therefore I didn't highlight it for you. But guidare means to drive. La macchina means the car. Moving on to the last one. Do you write books for your kids? And this is going to be the second person singular, that informal you form. Scrivi libri per I tuoi figli. So, yeah. Good job if you got them all right. Again, it's kind of confusing at first to conjugate in Italian, in any language, I think. But once you get the hang of it, it's really not that. It's kind of fun, actually. It's like solving a puzzle or like operating a machine. All right, moving on to the last regular types of verbs. We have ire verbs. Now, these ones are a little bit trickier, and that's because there are some ire verbs that are completely regular, and there are some that have a suffix added to them. And this suffix, you'll see later, is an isk verb. So unfortunately, there's no way to look at a verb and tell whether it's got a suffix or not, whether it's regular or has this suffix. And on top of that, for some verbs, you actually can, it has both the regular conjugation and this suffix form, and the two will actually mean slightly different things. I wouldn't worry too much about that now. Worry about that once you actually get the hang of conjugation, but just something to keep in mind. But I'm going to run through both regular and ISC IRE verbs. So I've got regular ones first. So the two examples I have here, servire and bollire, means to serve and to boil. So let's conjugate servire. We have servo, servi, serve, serviamo, servite, servono. Servo, servi, serve, serviamo, servite, servono. In the English equivalent right here. Now you'll notice that IRE verbs in regular form, they're the exact same as ERE verbs with the exception of one, voi. Voi is the only one where that second person plural is the only conjugation that's different between regular IRE and ERE verbs. So once again, if you want a little, a way to help remember them, ERE and IRE, they're very closely related, and that's going to be true for other tenses as well. And we can do the same thing with bollire if you want. Bollo, bolli, bolle, bolliamo, bollite, bollono. Obviously they're not written there, but this is going to hold for all regular IRE verbs. Now let's go through some of the suffix ones. And again, unfortunately, there's really no way to know which verbs are which IRE verbs use the suffix and which ones don't. You're just going to have to, as you see the verbs and you see the conjugations, you'll just kind of have to remember them. But you'll notice that they sound you can almost like tell when it sounds wrong. And I'm actually going to give you an example of that after this one. But let's see what these suffix verbs look like. So you have your root, right? Here's capire, which means to understand. Cap is the root. Well, for your suffix verbs, you'll take that stem and you'll add an isc, and then you'll add the ending. Effectively, that's sort of how you could think of this. So, let's run through them. Capisco, capisci, capisce, capiamo, capite, capiscono. You'll notice, again, the only thing you're adding is for these three subjects, just the singular subject pronouns and the third person plural. You're adding this isc in it, or ish if it's with an I or an E. I'll run through it again just for pronunciation. So capisco, capisci, capisce, capiamo, capite, capiscono. Now, what you'll notice is that if you try to say this stem with just the regular conjugation, it would be capo, capi, cape, capiamo, capite, capono. It almost, I don't know, maybe, I don't know if this is true or not. To me, it almost seems like you can kind of tell that doesn't sound quite right. Maybe that's just because I've heard the verb enough to, like, where I think it's not normal. I'm not really sure, but eventually you'll almost be able to tell which IRE verbs are going to take this suffix and which ones won't. It'll take time, but as you conjugate more and more, and I suggest you do thousands of these in each tense to get good at them, but obviously you need to learn the basics, so hopefully this is helping with that. And if you would like, we can conjugate guarire, which means to heal, in the same way. Guarisco, guarisci, guarisce, guariamo, guarite, guariscono. You know, doesn't really add too much to the story. Like I said, nice thing about conjugations is once you know them, it's like a machine. So, I'm just giving you a few more examples of these. Some regular IRE verbs. Dormire means to sleep. Coprire means to cover. Partire means to leave or depart. Your suffix verbs, fallire, punire, imporire. So I'm just going to conjugate these. Well, I don't know if I really need to, but you know, this one you would say fallisci, fallisco, fallisce. This one you would just say dormo, dormi, dorme. Again, once you get the hang of them, nice and easy. So let's do a regular example. This one, seguire, is going to be a regular verb. So your stem is obviously going to be this segu, everything besides the IRE. So if you want to try to conjugate that in all 6 present tense forms, you can pause this video and do that. Here is the answer. So we have seguo, segui, segue, seguiamo, seguite, seguono. Seguo, segui, segue, seguiamo, seguite, seguono. And let's go through a suffix version now. Same basic thing if you want to try to conjugate mentire, which means to lie, in all 6 forms. Go ahead, you can pause it, and here is the answer. So let's run through the pronunciation again. Mentisco, mentisci, mentisce, mentiamo, mentite, mentiscono. Mentisco, mentisci, mentisce, mentiamo, mentite, mentiscono. And once again, you'll notice that that stem is always going to be present in all of these regular verbs, which is really nice because these verbs are the vast majority you'll come across. But unfortunately, those irregular ones, which we're going to cover after this practice, are kind of hard to do. Oops, I hit the button twice. Well, alright, unfortunately I was going to do it the same way where I was going to give you time to try to conjugate these, but apparently I forgot to put the animation on this one, so I apologize for that. But let's run through it anyway. So we heal. Guarire, like I just said earlier, means to heal. It's an isc verb, but the nice thing is because it's the we form, noi, it's just going to be like a regular IRE verb, guariamo. But if it were first person singular, guarisco. Now if we want to say, I punish my kids when they lie, these are both IRE verbs, so I'm going to include both of them. Punisco I miei figli quando mentono. Now, mentire is actually one of those verbs that can be used in either format. You can either use the isc form or the regular form, so with suffix or without. I generally would actually use the suffix form. It just sounds correct to me, but that's one of those verbs where you can use the regular form. It can take either one. As far as I know, they don't have different meanings. Nobody's ever corrected me on that. If somebody knows about that and can challenge that, by all means, go ahead. But I've never heard that there's a difference between these two. There are some though where there is a definite difference. Where this could mean, for example, telling like a white lie, and this means like telling, like perjury or something. I'm not saying that's what this is, but just to kind of illustrate how these two can be different. That's what I'm referring to. They can mean almost completely different things. So, yeah. With that done, we've now finished the IRE verbs. And now we get to the irregular verbs. And these ones, again, unfortunately, there's really no pattern. You can't look at the stem for them. You can't like memorize any mechanical makeup. The only thing you can really memorize are the endings on them. So the best way to do this is to make a table and just kind of commit them to memory. So, like I said, a lot of these verbs you'll notice are ones you're probably going to say a lot. Fare, you're going to use a million times, more than that, because they use it for everything. It means like literally like if you're saying like this many years ago, you use fa, which is the third person singular format. The point is you're going to use these irregular verbs quite a bit, so it's good to commit them to memory. So I'm going to run through each column, and you'll see what I mean relatively quickly. I think that the only real common indicators you'll notice is that these verbs maintain the same basic endings as the regular verbs, but the stem trick, yeah, that doesn't work on these verbs. So fare. Once again, you have all your subjects listed right here. So let's run through them and commit them to memory. Faccio, fai, fa. Facciamo, fate, fanno. Once more. Faccio, fai, fa. Facciamo, fate, fanno. Moving on to essere, which means to be. It's another pretty important one to know. Sono, sei, è. Siamo, siete, sono. You'll notice that sono is used in both. That is correct. But based off of the context, because this is a third-person plural and this is a first-person singular, you'll know from the context of the sentence that you're either referring to the I, myself, or you're referring to they. Yeah, there's just I've never heard a sentence where I've been confused between these two before. It's usually pretty blatant. So let's run through it once more. Sono, sei, è. Siamo, siete, sono. Andare means to go. Vado, vai, va. Andiamo, andate, vanno. Vado, vai, va. Andiamo, andate, vanno. Avere is to have. It's similar if you've taken Spanish or French. It'll do the same functions. So if you're saying like I'm hungry, you'll say like I have hunger, o fame, or if I'm afraid, I'm tired. All of those you can use avere for. So again, another important one to know. If you don't, again, I'm assuming you all know the pronunciation, but the H in Italian is silent. So let's run through these. O, I, a, abbiamo, avete, hanno. O, I, a, abbiamo, avete, hanno. Volere means to want. Voglio, voi, vuole, vogliamo, volete, vogliono. Voglio, voi, vuole, vogliamo, volete, vogliono. Dire means to say. Dico, dici, dice. Diciamo, dite, dicono. Dico, dici, dice. Diciamo, dite, dicono. Venire means to come. Vengo, vieni, viene. Veniamo, venite, vengono. Vengo, vieni, viene. Veniamo, venite, vengono. And I've included some other ones. Again, I'm sorry, this is going to seem really redundant, but the only way to learn these is through repetition and memory, which is why I've put ones that I used a lot when I was learning Italian on here, and again, I think you'll find you're going to use a lot of them fairly regularly too. Potere and dovere especially. Those two are pretty important. Potere, let's start with that one, obviously on the left, means to be able to, or you could think of it as like I can do things, you can do things, so you'll probably use it a lot. Posso, puoi, può. Possiamo, potete, possono. Posso, puoi, può. Possiamo, potete, possono. Rimanere means to remain. Rimango, rimani, rimane. Rimaniamo, rimanete, rimangono. Rimango, rimani, rimane. Rimaniamo, rimanete, rimangono. Dovere means to have to. Devo, devi, deve. Dobbiamo, dovete, devono. Devo, devi, deve. Dobbiamo, dovete, devono. Uscire means to go out. Esco, esci, esce. Usciamo, uscite, escono. Esco, esci, esce. Usciamo, uscite, escono. Bere means to drink. Bevo, bevi, beve. Beviamo, bevete, bevono. Bevo, bevi, beve. Beviamo, bevete, bevono. Sapere means to know, like as in know facts, not as in know people. That is actually a different verb. Sapere means like if I say I know the capital of X country, that's sapere. So, sai, sa. Sappiamo, sapete, sanno. So, sai, sa. Sappiamo, sapete, sanno. Tenere means to hold. Tengo, tieni, tiene. Teniamo, tenete, tengono. Tengo, tieni, tiene. Teniamo, tenete, tengono. So these two tables contain a lot of the common irregular verbs. Practicing them is really, again, the only way to you have to really memorize them. As you can see, some of them you'll notice some patterns, but it's not, there's no uniform pattern as to how to come up with esco from uscire. That one, again, it's just something you'll have to remember. Just because of the way the language developed, that's just how some of these verbs are. So, now I am going to give you a few minutes, if you would like to pause the video, to try to fill out this conjugation table for all of these different verbs. I have marked the irregular verbs with asterisks, and I've also marked if they are IRE verbs, which ones use the suffix one, which ones use the isk suffix. So if you would like to fill out this table for practice, be my guest. I will run through it after you're done with this, if you're doing it. Otherwise, I guess whenever I decide to click the button to change it. So pause if you want to work on this. I'm going to move on now. So let's run through these verbs. We have guadagnare, which is a regular ARE verb. Guadagno, guadagni, guadagna, guadagniamo, guadagnate, guadagnano. Guadagno, guadagnani, guadagna, guadagniamo, guadagnate, guadagnano. We see the stem, guadagnan, stopping at the N, and we add our respective endings for each subject. Moving on. Mettere means to put. Metto, metti, mette. Mettiamo, mettete, mettono. Metto, metti, mette. Mettiamo, mettete, mettono. Once again, we see the stem, M-E-T-T, and we add our respective endings on. Since it's an E-R-E, obviously we have an E for the third person singular, and an E-T-E, and an O-N-O for the final two. Nuotare, an ARE verb, means to swim. We have nuoto, nuoti, nuota, nuotiamo, nuotate, nuotano. Nuoto, nuoti, nuota, nuotiamo, nuotate, nuotano. Nuotano. Ugh, oh my god, I need water. Alright. Moving on to finire, which is an IRE verb with the suffix. We have finisco, finisci, finisce, finiamo, finite, finiscono. Finisco, finisci, finisce, finiamo, finite, finiscono. And once again we see there is a stem there, this fin. We add our suffix, isc, and then we add our verb, our conjugation ending based on each subject. Andare, that was one of our irregulars, means to go. Vado, vai, va. Andiamo, andate, vanno. Vado, vai, va. Andiamo, andate, vanno. Moving on to prestare. It's a regular are verb, means to loan. Presto, presti, presta. Prestiamo, prestate, prestano. Presto, presti, presta. Prestiamo, prestate, prestano. Our stem, prest, prest, and we add our endings. Fare is another irregular verb. Means to make or to do, again, very important. Faccio, fai, fa. Facciamo, fate, fanno. Faccio, fai, fa. Facciamo, fate, fanno. So, some useful tips for you when conjugating in the present tense. You may have noticed that there are some endings that are pretty much distinctly shared by all formats. Like, so regardless of if the verb is an are, an ere, an ire, and if it's regular or irregular, first person singular verbs, those eo verbs, they'll always end in an o in the present tense. Second person singular verbs in the present tense will always end in an I for the informal version. Obviously, the formal version, you're just using the third person singular, so that's not applicable. And then for your first person plural verbs, those noi verbs, those we verbs, they all end in yamo. Obviously, remember that if you know the conjugations, you can look at any verb, teleradiotrasmettere. This looks like an intimidating word, and it's a pain to write it out, but it's the exact same thing you've always seen. It's just, here's your stem, teleradiotrasmet, cut off the ere, and then conjugate it. And a little interesting side note, you will notice as you learn more verbs that many times the Italian verbs, similar to English, I think, if you want to say that, it's a generic, like a base verb, and then you tack on these extra parts to further describe the verb. So here's mettere, you can see. And you'll see that with all sorts of verbs. Benedire, maledire, those extracts from dire mean like to bless or curse, what have you. So just keep that in mind. Once you know these conjugations, you can look at any verb and you'll have a conjugation for it. If it's irregular, it's going to be wrong, but believe me, there were plenty of times when I was learning Italian when I would try to use regular conjugations for irregular verbs. It happens to everybody. The more mistakes you make, the more you'll learn, so don't feel bad. And last but certainly not least, irregular verbs, you're just going to have to memorize them. But the one good thing is that at the very least you can get the endings for the irregular verbs correct. It's still ending with an O, ending with an I if you're in the informal second person singular. So keep these tips in mind. I hope you found this video helpful, or at least interesting, or hopefully it gave you some extra practice at least. And if you have any further questions or comments about any of the content in this video, feel free to leave a comment or email or message. Hopefully my voice didn't mess up any of the pronunciations. in there and during the middle. I'm a little dry tonight. But I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching this whole video if you stuck around this long.